Hello everyone, I'm Sahid. Thank you for clicking this video. I am very happy that you're here. Today I'll be continuing my chapter series on Blessings by Chukwuebuka Ibeh, and today we'll be reading part 2, chapter 14. I'm very glad that you're still here supporting me as we continue this chapter series. I'm very glad that we've made it to chapter 14 and that we're going to continue reading this really amazing book that I've just been having so much fun reading with you guys and getting to know the different characters and just deeply connect. Just based on what I've read so far, I've just felt seen in a huge part of this book, and even if not all of this book. I feel so connected to the main character Obi Funa, and as somebody who's a Nigerian boy, a teenage boy, a queer boy, a boy who deals with family dynamics issues, a boy who's still trying to be sort of, I guess, confidence in himself in a way, or sort of having a strong sense of who I am, my identity, despite the complexity. And so this book has just really meant a lot to me, and I really admire Chukwuebuka Ibe for writing this just really beautiful story. But like my other chapter videos, I like to give sort of a brief recap of sort of the previous chapter before the chapter that I'm going to be reading today, which is chapter 14. But to give a recap about chapter 13, in chapter 13, we sort of explore the main character, Obi Funa, sort of having this sort of deep, sort of sense of shame and guilt in himself. Like we read from the chapter before chapter 13, he had this sort of relationship with this other boy at his school called Sparrow. And Sparrow was sort of the school guy. He had a sense of conceited energy to him. He had a friend group. Students found them as sort of cool guys. They dressed immaculate. They had sort of these expensive watches on their wrists, and even teachers adored them. Teachers sort of praised them in a way. And anyways, Sparrow and Obi Funa had this sort of moment in which he Sparrow was looking for a tie as he was about to do his prefectship sort of speech, because this is something that's common for the students who are about to go to SS3, I believe, or SS2. I think it's SS2 that you get the chance to run for prefect and to become one of the school leaders. Prefects are sort of the school leaders at the school. And so he didn't have a tie, and so he asked Obi Funa's friend Jeku, who was also running, but Jeku sort of confronted him in a way that do you think you're the only one running? I need my tie, in a way, sort of emphasizing the fact that he needs his tie. But Obi Funa, on the other hand, wasn't sure if he wanted to run, and he ended up not running, and so he decided to give or offer Sparrow his tie. And Jeku, on the other hand, his friend who has helped him navigate through this new sort of boarding school experience, since his father, Anansi, sent him away to boarding school due to obviously his identity and his sort of relationship with this other boy, this character that we've sort of read, know more about and read about throughout this book called A Boy. And he was kicked. A boy was kicked out, and Obi Funa was sent to boarding school. But to get back to sort of Sparrow and Obi Funa's relationship, they sort of formed this friendship relationship, and then it got to a point in which it got really intimate. And then when it got to when it got really intimate, they started to do this sort of like as a routine until something finally happened that put them at sort of at jeopardy in a way, particularly Sparrow. So they were caught sort of having this intimate moment with one another by one of the admins in the school, Sir CY. And after he catches them, Obi Funa had his back face to the person, so and this was sort of in the dark. The man had a torchlight, but he couldn't see Obi Funa, so Obi Funa quickly ran, and he was able to escape that. But on the other hand, Sparrow was caught, and due to this, the admins reported him. The story got out. The people, the other boys in the school found out. And people humiliated him. People embarrassed him. He felt ashamed, guilty, but yet he did not confess to doing it with Obifuna. And Obifuna, a part of him felt sad at the fact of just seeing how Sparrow was treated, but a deep part of him also felt as though the fact that he was going to end up getting kicked out, which he did end up getting kicked out from the school, was a sense of relief to him. He knew this was an evil sort of thinking, but deep down he didn't want to get caught, because the whole reason he's in boarding school is because his father wanted him to, I guess, remove that part of him, that homosexual part of him, and reinvent himself in a way and do better things with his life. And so, anyways, in chapter 13, Obifuna sort of, is filled with this sense of shame and guilt, and he's trying to figure out what he's gonna do. And as we have read about by now, we know that in this book it's very heavy on sort of the idea that in the boarding school is very religious. Like many Nigerian boarding schools, they are very sort of religious in a way. And so the students in the school, the boys often have, Sunday sermons in which they do prayers. They have the chaplains who are doing preaches and speaking about what's, preaching about things that's happening in their society, and sort of encouraging the teenage boys to do right, to, ask for forgiveness. And so during this one sermon that I think the title was A Reprobate Mind, Obifuna was listening to things that, the chaplain was saying, and he felt a deep sense of guilt and shame, and just fear that, oh my God, like, does the chaplain know what I've done? And he's trying to just but basically he ends up feeling as though he needs to speak to the chaplain privately. And so at first he was undecided, because he knew the possibility of what could come if he simply opened his mouth to tell them what he had done. He knew the awful things, the way they would look at him, the judgment in people's eye. Even his friend Jeku asked him, because he could see the sort of sadness and fear in Obifuna's attitude and sort of emotions, and sort of asked him how he was doing. And Obifuna just couldn't admit to it, because he knew just the possibility of Jeku maybe not being his friend anymore, avoiding him, judging him for who he was, and all these things just really made him scared. So he ended up going to the chaplain's house that wasn't sort of far away from the campus. He goes there. The chaplain wasn't there, so he gets to meet his wife. She's this sort of Nigerian woman who just looks like she's been going through it. Either she has a cold, she has sort of like puffiness under her eye, and Obifuna just sort of when he enters their home after she let him in, and sort of lets him sit in their house while he waits. He could send this sort of aura to the space he was in, that sort of aura that wasn't necessarily good. It was sort of something different in a way that made Obifuna feel slightly weird. But to continue, this woman is sort of, at some point questioning him why he came here, and if he could, share what, he came here to talk to her husband about, since her husband, wouldn't be back until a while later. And so she's asking these questions, but Obifuna is like, no, I want to, I think he said he wanted to, he wasn't sure if he wanted to share it with her, and he felt more comfortable sharing with the chaplain. And basically the lady, he could see sort of, this, or she could see the sense of sort of, I guess, fear in his eyes. And he also at some point was thinking about it, but he hesitated, and he was like, no, I can't do this, in his mind. And then the lady was later on, I believe she said, God is the one who forgives all sins. So whatever, it is that you wanted to let him know, ask for forgiveness. I don't remember the exact quote, but it was something relating to that. And Obifuna and her, after he left the house, trying to escape her sort of interrogation, or her sort of questioning on why he came here, he, left. I thought a bell was rang for, I think it was for the ending of prep or something. But to continue, he just keeps thinking about the words that she said, and he sort of felt seen in a way. And so he ended up making the decision to start, going to the chapel to pray. I believe he joined like a prayer club in which he started praying more, and just starting to sort of commit himself more to God in a way to ask for forgiveness, in a way to understand and you know gain a sense of, I guess, hope about, or a sense of confidence again, because he has been filled with just so much fear and uncertainty and so much shame and guilt, all these negative emotions that sort of ruin and causing a part of him to become really dark and sad. But anyways, he commits to, he sort of is on this new religious path in which, he's talking to God more, but also deep down he questions why sort of God made him the way he is, why God made him in this quote unquote wrong way, because of sort of how society has treated him, and so all these things he has noticed about his identity that's making him, be different in a way, and this is something that many queer people have to deal with, many young people who are still figuring themselves out, and it's just really sad. And I just really felt, connected in a way to how he felt as though he needed to now connect more and sort of be more faithful in a way. And all these things are things that I still struggle with, and many queer people struggle with. So yeah, it was really interesting reading that. But yeah, that's sort of my recap about chapter 13. Today I will be reading chapter 14. Thank you once again for being here, and I hope you stick all the way to the end. Okay. Part 2, Chapter 14. Obiageli had lived a fascinating life. As a young girl, she was convinced she would become a famous singer, subjecting Uzuamaka to long sessions of make-believe stage performances, which ended with Uzuamaka applauding with all her might because she did not have the heart to tell Obiageli the truth. In secondary school, she had lived in secondary school, she had decided she would become a nurse, joking about inflicting the same pain of injections on others as she had received in her life. After 3 JAMB failures in a row, she finally graduated with a second-class lower degree in agriculture, much to their parents' disappointment. She had worked at the post office, taught for a few years at a secondary school, and held a position at the local government office, a job secured for her by the man with whom she was in a relationship for 9 years, a man whom she had believed was a childless widower. When she learned of his living wife and thriving marriage, his 4 children, the first nearly as old as she was, she broke it off and declared herself eternally celibate. God and godliness were her theme now. Uzumaka did not know why she had decided, of all her options, to go to Obiageli. Anozi had informed her of Obifuna's scheduled return for the session holidays. Anozi's sister was unavailable for the duration, away in Lagos to care for her daughter and newly born grandson. And frankly, Uzuamaka, and frankly, Uzuamaka, he added, this is becoming ridiculous. You can't keep on hiding this from him. He will find out one way or the another. And frankly, Uzuamaka, he added, this is becoming ridiculous. You can't keep on hiding this from him. He will find out one way or another. Uzuamaka had toyed with the idea of staying. She had gone over the conversation in her head, pictured his face when he heard the news, crafted alternative scenarios, and, in the end, 2 days before his arrival, she called Obiageli. She expected to be turned down, and when Obiageli paused after she asked, Uzumaka prepared her apologies in her head, but Obiageli said, "About time. It's been too long. Adannam." Uzumaka liked the house. She liked the sparse orderliness of the living area, the spacious balcony where she sat on most evenings to receive fresh air. She liked most of all the fact that she was often alone, her mind permitted to freely wander. Obiageli left for work in the mornings before Uzumaka woke up. When she returned home in the evenings, she busied herself around the house without paying Uzumaka any mind. She went for vigils on Fridays and returned in the morning tired, her eyes crusty from sleep. Still, Uzumaka could sense Obiageli watching her curiosity nagging at her. Sometimes she asked Uzumaka what was wrong. "Why do you think something is wrong?" Uzumaka retorted one time. Obiageli scoffed, shrugging in a way that said, "Wasn't it obvious? Because even if you try your best to avoid me, whenever things get really bad, you run to me," she said. Uzumaka stared at her in wordless surprise. Distance made it so easy to think of people with fondness and forget what made you leave them in the first place. She felt her anger amass slowly within her until it solidified into a blinding rage, propelling her to march into her room and gather her clothes from the hangers to fit into her bag. Midway, she remembered she had some clothes on the line from her morning laundry, and so she put off leaving until the next day. By evening, the worst phase of her anger had subsided, and she was able finally to set aside Obiageli's spite and admit the truth of her words. They had been such good friends as children. There was a time when they could easily tell what the other was thinking, but Uzumaka had spent most of her teenage years apart from Obiageli, serving as a housekeeper for their maternal aunt, who, in return, paid for her secondary school education. She had returned home after 5 years to meet an uncouth Obiageli who picked random unprovoked fights and talked back at her with a new viciousness, disregarding the 3 years birth gap between them. Their parents' deference to Uzumaka had only further incensed Obiageli. Uzumaka could not point at a reason that made sense. It was difficult to grasp that it was difficult to grasp the possibility that Obiageli envied her. Obiageli was lighter skinned, conventionally prettier, and she had her university education, a privilege Uzumaka had been denied. Uzumaka sometimes found herself in the odd position of having to downplay her small, inconsequential victories, loathing undeserved credit to Obiageli, if only to positively improve their parents' perception of her and in turn improve Obiageli's own perception of Uzumaka. But in the end, there was no appeasing Obiageli. Still, there were instances when Obiageli had been able to surprise Uzumaka. Only Obiageli had supported her decision to marry Anozi. Her parents had disapproved of him even before they met him. Although he, too, was Igbo, they did not like the fact that he was not from their own state. And when they finally met him, furnished with details of his job as a trader and his one-room apartment in a run-down part of town, they asked her if she had been bewitched. "He looks like he really needs you," Obiageli told her later. He looks like he really needs you. Obiageli told her later, surprising her. See the way he was looking at you, as if he would die if anything stops him from marrying you. She laughed. Biko, follow the man, oh. Let someone's blood not be on your head. For a whole year after the wedding, her parents spoke little to her. It was Obiageli who stayed close, sending sackfuls of foodstuffs and lending money whenever Uzoamaka asked, even if she also gleefully reported the situation to their parents. When the miscarriages came, her parents had declared themselves vindictive. Her parents had declared themselves vindicated. It was Obiageli after the fort who had showed up one morning unannounced and dragged her off the bed where she had lain nearly unmoving for a week, willing herself to die, to Obiageli's own apartment, where, over the next few weeks, she nursed Uzoamaka back to health. A few days after Uzoamaka decided to stay, Obiageli came home from work with a plastic bag and a mischievous smile. I got you Oka and Ube from the vendor down the street. She's my customer and she reserves the best ones for me. Uzoamaka almost smiled back as she extracted a cob of corn from the bag Obiageli extended. The heat burned her palms through the newspaper it had been wrapped in. Obiageli was pouring hot water into a plate to soften the pears with which the corn was to be eaten. It was the closest to an apology Uzoamaka would get. I'm sick, Obiageli, Uzoamaka said. Obiageli looked up. Ewo, sorry. She felt Uzoamaka's temperature with the back of her palm. How is he doing you? Uzoamaka shrugged herself free. It's not that. She took a breath, steeled herself. They say it's cancer. Obiageli laughed then. The sound was without mirth. It was cackly, frightened. Oh, Yibo, you're just unwell, Uzoamaka. I'm on chemotherapy treatments, Uzoamaka said. She had the feeling of pressing down on an unhealed wound, watching for a reaction. The doctor said I don't have much longer. Who would you rather believe, God or the doctors? It's this last stage. It's last stage, Obi. Just shut up, Uzoamaka, Obiageli shouted, rising. Her legs caught on the foot of the wooden table before her, and it fell to the floor, cobs of corn landing around Uzoamaka's feet. Obiageli went to stand by the window with her back turned to Uzoamaka. She stood for a long time with her shoulders hunched forward and her head bent. Uzoamaka imagined she was crying silently, but when she finally spoke, her voice was clear. You will go with me to my pastor. The devil is a big liar. The pastor was a small man with a clean-shaven head. Uzoamaka had spent so long imagining his features from the many stories Obiageli told of him that she was slightly disappointed sitting across from him. Obiageli introduced her as the only family I have left. The pastor nodded piously. Uzoamaka prepared to go on her knees and have him lay hands on her, but he told them to extend their hands, and he said the prayers from where he sat. He accepted the envelope Uzumaka passed across with a tight, sympathetic smile. He didn't even touch me, Uzumaka said to Obiageli on the bus ride home. What? Your pastor? I saw the way his hands were shaking when he took the envelope from me. He made sure our hands did not touch. Obiageli gave her a long look, and then she sighed. This isn't going to work if you don't believe it will, Uzumaka. Now, as Obiageli sat beside her in a taxi headed for the market, her sister hummed under her breath. There was something different about her now, even as they prayed every night of the week holding hands together, Obiageli binding and casting demons from generations back. Uzumaka sensed Obiageli's terror. 3 nights ago, Obiageli had broken down sobbing in the middle of their prayers, and Uzumaka stood there watching, thinking about how grief had a way of humbling even the most uncharitable. She knew then she had made the right decision to come here, to put off telling Obifunna in the meantime. In the meantime, let him have a few more months of blissful obliviousness. Let him not have to watch for long. Let him not have to watch for long as she slowly faded away. Do you remember Achalogo? Obiageli said, startling Uzumaka. Who? Achalogo now? Obiageli pressed. From the village, the one that used to dress like a woman. That plays the ogene. Gam, Obiageli said. What about him? Nothing, no. I've just been hearing his songs in my head. Nothing, no. Nothing, no. I've just been hearing his songs in my head all day. Obiageli laughed. Remember I used to dance for him? Uzumaka chuckled. How could she not remember? Obiageli would never let her live down that memory. She said, I wonder where he is now. Obiageli shrugged. Last I heard, he was in his little hut in the village. Such talents going to waste. Uzumaka nodded agreement. Memories of him flooded her mind. She could picture him in his low-cut blouse and skirt, his solid headgear. His makeup was unparalleled. There was no one she knew who could match his abilities as an entertainer. His touch on the ogene was second to none. His talent as mysterious as his own life. He was a favorite of the village chief, who often invited him to perform at the palace, and sometimes in the village square. Uzumaka had once tried to join his dance crew. She had never been one to dance, but she had followed Obiageli to the audition. She remembered now that the costume allotted to her had been too tight around the chest and made of a kind of fabric that grated on her skin. She had failed at the dance, getting the moves wrong and persistently lagging behind until she was asked to leave. The other girls laughed, loud enough for Uzumaka to disappear into the bush and break down in tears. Midway, she heard leaves rustling, the sound of footsteps approaching, and she straightened up, wiped her eyes. It took her a moment to recognize Achalogo. With his mannerisms, his beardless, heavily made-up face in the waning evening light, he could have passed for any other woman around. Why are you crying? He asked her. He had a serious look on her face. She dug her heel in the soil without responding. So you don't know how to dance, eh? Is that the end of the world? If you are not good at one thing, you find your strength in another. Aboraya. His voice had a funny sounding high pitch, or maybe it was simply not what she had come to expect from men. Wipe your eyes, Biko. Come outside and join in the fun. He held her hand and led her out, back to the square. His kindness had allowed her to return to the audition as a spectator without feeling shame, to brush aside Obiageli's gloating after she was selected for the crew. It had been a lifetime ago, and the memory of the encounter was dim, but it had come back to her once in 2005, when she arrived home from work to the sound of music coming from the sitting room. She was aware by then of Obi Funa's gift, his fascination for P Square, the group of identical twin brothers whose songs dominated the radio, which she sometimes watched while Obi Funa, only 13, tried to imitate their dance steps. He would use Ekene as a substitute to replicate the group, and she observed with amusement as Ekene fumbled through the dances, utterly perplexed as to why he was doing them anyway. Anozi, with his austere taste, disapproved of the songs, changing the station whenever they came on, and he forbade the boys from listening. That day, she peered through the window of the living room, and suddenly, powerfully, Achalogo was brought to the fore, made stark by the sight of Obi Funa dancing, the sweat coating his bare skin as he moved from one end of the room to the other, screaming the lyrics of the song Busybody. He was he was disobeying Anozi. He could get in real trouble if found out, but he was dancing, doing with ease something Uzumaki could only dream of. Something about the joy on his face, the sheer freedom, made Uzumaki remain where she was a moment longer. He made a smooth forward-backward move, twisted his waist to both sides with impossible flexibility, and twirled without effort in the air. In that moment, she caught a glimpse of his smiling face, bearing witness to the absolute happiness he radiated, and against her conscious will, Uzumaki found her heart singing. And that is the end of chapter 14. Let's talk about it. So, essentially, chapter 14 sort of explores Uzumaki's sort of perspective in a way, and her relationship with her sister Obiageli. And then we also return back to her continuous difficulty expressing the truth of what's currently going on with her health and herself to her son Obifuna. So to begin, Uzumaki and Obiageli are siblings who are kind of opposite from one another, and they have this sort of complex relationship. We are sort of first introduced sort of about Obiageli's sort of passion at some point to want to become a singer, and that obviously didn't work out. She didn't end up doing that. We also get a sort of her perspective about sort of then ended up wanting to become a nurse, and then her failed sort of jam exams, and how she graduated as a low graduate. And then we also explore Obiageli's sort of relationship with this one man who happened to have been married and had kids, and they had been together for 9 years. Not just for her to find out later on that he had this family of his own. And so this sort of put her in this point in which she just chose to go into become eternally celibate, and she decides not to engage with no man, and do any sort of obviously sexual things, because celibacy requires you sort of removing yourself and detaching yourself from that part of your identity or of yourself and how you know explore the world in a way. And so she became celibate, and this was a decision she made due to obviously this heartbreaking thing that she found out after being with somebody for such a long time, just to know or find out that they're married and have a whole family. And my question in that moment was like, how did she not know? But to continue, she now made this new pact in which she was all about, God and praising God and on her, just her very religious and faithful journey. And so she's very strong on, going to church, having a pastor. Um, but to before I continue on Obi Ageli, sort of characteristics as we come to read about in this chapter, I want to talk about Obiagali and Uzumaka relationship. So from prior chapters, we read how sometimes Uzumaka would go to Obiageli for just to talk sometimes. So for example, when um you know Obi Funa was about to get to sorry Obi Funa was about to go to boarding school. I remember Uzumaka calling Obiageli to sort of talk to her about the decision that her husband Anansi was now initiating and sort of wanting Obifuna to do, and she called Obiageli in a way to sort of get advice on this whole situation and sort of expressing to Obiageli that she didn't agree with this and she didn't want this for her son. But Obiageli, as somebody who is basically the only person who, as we come to read in this chapter, she's sort of the only person who actually likes Anazi in her family. Her parents do not like Anazi. When she got married to him, her parents did not talk to her for a while. And so Obiageli is sort of the only one who sort of advised her to, to continue to be with Anazi because she saw that he loved her in a way. But yeah, I remember how, I know Uzumaka went to Obiageli during the time when Anazi was trying to send Obi to boarding school and how she, advised her that, this wasn't the best, decision, but she felt as though, Anazi was probably the one who just knew the best choice for his son, and so that's what she tells Uzumaka, and Uzumaka was obviously frustrated by this. This is not what she wanted to hear from her sister, and so she hung up. And so that was sort of how I first got introduced to Obiageli and Uzumaka, sort of slightly complex relationship. But we get to read more in this chapter as we see how even different things with Obiageli and Uzumaka, they just didn't agree on many things, and um, they had slight disapprovals and things like that. And we also get to see sort of how Obiageli always knew in a way that Uzumaka would come to her and sort of reach out to her. And deep down, Uzumaka didn't want to accept the truth, but she knew that this was the truth. She was her sister, and so whenever she would need to talk about it, she would go to her sister. But yeah, we read about that, and then also we sort of explore this moment in which she goes to visit Obiageli in a way to sort of deal with the fact that she still was struggling to, express the truth of what was going on to Obifuna, her son, about her sickness, in which we found out about in the previous chapters before this that she, has cancer, and this is something that's been going on for the several months now, and she's still not told her son. Obviously, her husband knows, and he's sort of insisting that she tells her son because it's getting too late. Things, time is running out. She's gotten to a really late point of this disease and this major thing in her life, and she needs to tell her son. And so this is something that Anazi is initiating, but she's still fearful. She knows deeply how this will hurt Obifuna. And based on other chapters, we see that even when she had like a fall and had a really big bruise, Obifuna panicked and had a really bad fever due to her just being hurt. And so we know that Obifuna and Uzumaka relationship is really tight, and Obifuna will really be crushed by hearing that his mother has this really sad sickness that, possibly she's going to die soon, and it's just really sad. Um, and it makes me want to cry because um, I can imagine when Obi finds out about this, how sad he possibly will be. Imagine having this mother who, okay, I'm getting emotional, who obviously just really loves you. And, you know, as I was reading this chapter, I also got really emotional when it got to the part, when, I know I'm sort of jumping ahead, but when it got to the part in which, um, Obi Funa was viewed by Uzumaki of a reminder of somebody she knew during her early childhood with her sister Obiageli in the village. There was a man called Achalogo who was a fierce dancer. He had her dance crew in which her sister Obiageli was part of, and she once went to this audition with her sister, and she saw just how much talent the man had. And when she saw Obi Funa dancing in their sitting room to one of P Square's song, Busybody, she really admired, and it reminded her so much of the guy. And she just knew from there he was a special boy. And this was something that she obviously, based on what we read about, that she didn't know how to dance. Obviously, her sister knew how to dance, but she didn't, unfortunately, know how to dance. So this was something that a part of her dreamed of, and she knew she couldn't do as good as her son, and so she just admired him. And a part of her just really was happy to see how just freely he did it, how happy he did it, and how just much he enjoyed doing that, and enjoyed dancing. And it made me think about me as a child. I just really love dancing. I still do love dancing, but as a child I just did it so freely and just happily. And just reading this made me think to myself, and I could just remember the joy dancing brings me. And so reading that made me really sad. And then also reading the fact that, you know, coming to see her sister Obiageli was a way of, escaping the reality that she has to tell her son um, this sad thing that's happening in her life, because her son is in boarding school before he comes back. Um, it was just really sad reading that, but I'm looking forward to seeing how Obi Funa reacts to this. And I'm just really looking forward to seeing what's gonna happen. I will be sad if she ends up dying. And I would probably cry because obviously, based on what we've read throughout this book, Uzumaki just been that mother that I think a son needs, and she just loves her son, and she cares deeply about her child. And it really warms my heart because it reminds me of my mother, and it reminds me of my mom, and how much she cares about me, even though when it comes to certain things that she doesn't agree on, the conventional things, the traditional things, she still loves her son. Certain things that she knows her husband, I know, he disagrees with, a part of her still tries a way to admire those parts of her son, even though a part of her still feels as though maybe he could be slightly a bit more conventional in a way. But yeah, that's sort of my recap of what I read in chapter 14. Thank you so much for watching this video. This is what books do to you. This is what reading does to you. You are sort of put into this different body, or this sort of character that just reaches you and connects to you, and you just get emotional. And so that's me getting emotional and just feeling so connected to a book. And so yeah, thank you so much for watching this video. I really appreciate it. If you enjoy this video, please kindly subscribe, like, and comment. Thank you so much for your continuous support, and I hope you watch the upcoming chapter videos. Thank you.